18 hours without rest had a way of burning fear out of a person. So when Adrian Moretti's bodyguard put a gun to her chest, Lucy Bennett didn't scream. She just wiped the coffee off her apron, looked the most dangerous man in the city in the eye, and said the 4 words that should have gotten her killed. "Fire me then." What happened instead would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. The rain hadn't stopped since 10. Outside Gina's Ristorante, the old neon sign buzzed against the wet dark of the avenue, throwing red light across cobblestones slick with runoff. Inside, the air was thick with garlic and candle wax, and the particular exhaustion that settles over a restaurant somewhere past midnight, when the wealthy regulars linger over wine and the staff start counting minutes instead of tables. Lucy Bennett leaned against the service counter and rolled her shoulders, trying to shake an ache that had taken up permanent residence in her spine hours ago. 29 years old, built soft and sturdy in a yellow uniform. 2 washes past clean, she'd worked 18 straight hours, covering for 2 employees who'd called in sick, skipping dinner, ignoring the throb in her swollen feet. Her brown hair had escaped its bun in messy pieces around her flushed face. Her name tag, crooked on her collar, read Lucy. She hadn't cried, not tonight, not yet. 3 years since her mother died, 2 since her father's stroke left him unable to work, unable to do much of anything except sit by the window and worry about bills neither of them could pay. The hospital debt alone could bury her. Her manager reminded her of that debt every time he threatened to fire her, which lately was almost daily. Gina's Ristorante didn't know any of that. It just saw a tired maid clearing plates, jazz humming low over the sound system, golden light pooling over white tablecloths and Italian oil paintings, wealthy customers who tipped badly and looked through her like glass. Then the doors opened and the restaurant went quiet in a way Lucy had never heard before. Adrian Moretti walked in like the room already belonged to him. 2 bodyguards flanked him, built like something meant to block doorways, eyes already sweeping the room out of pure habit. But it was the man between them who sucked the air out of the place. Black tailored suit, tattoos climbing the side of his neck above a crisp collar, slick dark hair, a trimmed beard, a watch that costs more than Lucy's yearly rent. His stare alone made people find something urgent to do with their napkins. "He owns half the city," someone whispered 2 tables over. "Don't look at him," someone else hissed back. "That's Adrian Moretti." Lucy had heard the name whispered over cocktail orders for years. Moretti, whose enemies had a habit of quietly disappearing, whose name alone made grown businessmen stammer. She didn't have the energy to be afraid of him tonight. She had a shift to survive. She approached his table anyway. Someone had to. "Black coffee," he said, without looking up from his phone. "Pasta," and silence. She didn't smile. She didn't tremble either. She simply nodded and turned back toward the kitchen, too tired for either performance. 10 minutes later, she returned, tray balanced, coffee steaming. She'd almost reached his table when a nervous waiter cut too close behind her, his elbow catching her hip hard enough to throw her off balance. The tray dipped. The mug tipped. Scalding coffee aft across the white tablecloth and splashed directly onto the sleeve of Adrian Moretti's suit. The restaurant went dead silent. Adrian looked down at the dark stains spreading across his cuff. Slowly, he set down his phone. Slowly, he stood. "Clumsy," he said, voice low and terrible. "Useless. Embarrassing." He turned toward the trembling manager hovering near the kitchen doors. "Fire her." Something in Lucy, 3 years of grief, of aching feet, of being invisible to men, exactly like this one, finally reached its limit. She felt it break clean through her chest like a dam giving way. She stepped forward. She looked directly into his eyes, and every instinct in the room told her to stop, to apologize, to beg. Instead, she lifted her hand and pointed straight at him. "Fire me then." The words hit the restaurant like a gunshot. A bodyguard's hand moved toward his jacket. Customers ducked low behind their tables. Wine glasses forgotten. Somewhere near the bar, a woman gasped into her palm. Adrian Moretti went very, very still. Nobody breathed. Not the frozen waiters, not the manager, halfway to the phone to call the police, or maybe an ambulance, or maybe a priest. Not Lucy, who stood there with her chest heaving and her hands still raised, absolutely certain she had just signed her own death warrant. For 3 long seconds, nothing moved. Then Adrian Moretti's mouth curved, not into a snarl, Not into the fury the entire room was braced for, into a smile, slow, genuine, almost curious, like he was seeing something he hadn't seen in a very long time. He studied her, the flushed face, the stained apron, the trembling hand still pointed at his chest, and said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket, and Lucy's whole body went cold. But he only pulled out a card, setting it gently on the table beside the ruined tablecloth. "I'll remember your name, Lucy." He turned and walked out into the rain, his men falling in behind him, leaving her standing in the wreckage of a night that had, in one impossible sentence, just begun to change everything. Lucy had no idea that one sentence would flip her entire world upside down. Would you have had the courage to say, "Fire me then," to the most feared man in the city? Or would fear have won? Drop A if you'd have said it too, and tell me in the comments, has there ever been a moment in your life where you finally hit your breaking point and spoke up? I want to hear your story. Chapter 2 drops next. Trust me, what happens to Lucy next will shock you completely. Lucy spent the rest of her shift waiting to die. Every headlight through the rain-streaked windows made her flinch. Every time the bell above the door jingled, she braced for the men in black suits who would drag her out into the night and make her disappear the way everyone said Moretti's enemies disappeared. She scrubbed tables that were already clean. She avoided the manager's eyes. She counted the minutes until close, certain each one might be her last. Nothing happened. By the time she clocked out at 2 in the morning, the restaurant had emptied. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and Lucy Bennett was still, impossibly, alive. She walked home anyway, 3 blocks in the wet dark, glancing over her shoulder more than once, half expecting a car to slow beside her. None did. By the time she reached her building, the adrenaline had drained out of her completely, leaving behind the familiar bone-deep exhaustion that never really left anymore. Her apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a kitchenette barely big enough to turn around in, a window unit that rattled more than it cooled. But it was warm, and it was theirs. And when she stepped inside, she found her father exactly where she always did, in his armchair by the window, a blanket over his knees, a mystery novel open on his lap, even though the stroke had made reading slow and effortful for him. "You're late," he said, not looking up, though his voice carried no real complaint in it. "Busy night." She hung her coat, kept her back to him a moment longer than necessary. "You look like you fought a war, Lucia." Something like that. She managed a smile as she crossed to kiss his forehead. His hand, the good one, found hers and squeezed it, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. He didn't know about the coffee, the humiliation, the gun that had almost been pointed at his daughter over a stained sleeve. She wasn't going to tell him. He had enough to carry. She got him settled for the night, laid out his morning pills, checked the lock twice out of habit. That had nothing to do with tonight, and everything to do with 3 years of being the only person standing between her father and disaster. Then she went into the bathroom, turned on the tap so he wouldn't hear, and finally let herself cry. Not loud, not long, just the quiet, exhausted kind of crying that came from being tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Tired of surviving, tired of apologizing for existing, tired of a life that kept asking more of her than she had left to give. She was asleep within minutes of climbing into bed, and she didn't dream of Adrian Moretti at all. The next morning she went in early, not for a shift, but to collect what she assumed would be her final paycheck. She'd already decided she wouldn't fight it. There was no point. But the moment she stepped through the doors of Gina's Ristorante, she knew something was wrong. The staff stood clustered near the bar, whispering, faces pale. The old owner, a stooped man named Marchetti, who'd run the place for 30 years, was nowhere to be seen. In his place, seated calmly at the corner booth with a folder open in front of him, was Adrian Moretti. Lucy's stomach dropped straight through the floor. He bought it. He bought the whole restaurant just to fire me himself. She stood frozen near the entrance, half ready to turn and walk straight back out into the street, when Adrian looked up and found her with his eyes like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Ah," he said. "Lucy." The staff turned to stare at her too, and she felt the full weight of every gaze in the room as she forced herself forward, chin up, refusing to let her hands shake. "Mr. Marchetti retired last night," Adrian said, closing the folder. "Sold the restaurant. I own it now." He let that settle over the room before continuing, voice even, unreadable. "Effective immediately. There will be some changes to staffing." Lucy's jaw tightened. "Here it comes." "Lucy Bennett," he said, and every syllable of her name in his mouth made her brace for the blow. "Isn't fired." Silence. Confused glances passed between the staff. "She's promoted," he continued. "Operations manager. New salary, nearly triple what she was making. Full medical coverage. And a share of quarterly profits." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Lucy stared at him, certain she'd misheard, certain this was some elaborate cruelty she hadn't yet understood the shape of. "No," she said, before she'd even decided to speak. Adrian's brow lifted slightly, the first genuine surprise she'd seen cross his face. "I said no." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I don't know what this is. Some kind of joke. Or a punishment I haven't figured out yet. But I don't want it." The staff around her looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Perhaps she had. But something about the calm, proprietary way Adrian Moretti was rearranging her entire life without asking made her skin crawl more than any threat could have. Adrian studied her for a long moment, that same unreadable half-smile from the night before ghosting at the corner of his mouth. "You'll change your mind," he said simply. Then he buttoned his jacket and walked out into the grey morning without another word, leaving the entire staff staring after him, and leaving Lucy standing in the middle of the restaurant that used to be her whole tired world, wondering what exactly she'd just refused. She didn't go home right away. Instead, needing air and needing to think, she wandered back toward the manager's office to grab her old apron from the closet. That was when she saw it, tucked behind a loose panel at the back of the shelf, half hidden beneath a stack of old invoices. An old iron key, tarnished with age, far too ornate for anything in this building. Lucy picked it up slowly, turning it over in her fingers, a strange cold feeling settling low in her stomach. It didn't match any lock she recognized. She took the job 3 days later, not because she trusted Adrian Moretti. She didn't, not for a second, but because her father's specialist appointment cost more than she'd make in a month at her old wage, and pride didn't pay hospital bills. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she'd walk the moment something felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. She took the job anyway. Adrian didn't gloat when she came to tell him. He simply nodded, slid a folder of paperwork across his desk, and said, "Good," like the outcome had never been in question. That, more than anything, unsettled her. He didn't act like a man who'd won something. He acted like a man whose plans were simply, quietly unfolding. The first week, Lucy kept her guard fully raised. She watched him the way she'd watch a stove burner she wasn't sure was off. But Adrian Moretti didn't behave like the man from that first night. He came by most afternoons, always briefly, always with some folder or signature he claimed to need, though Lucy began to suspect the paperwork was an excuse. He watched her work, watched her calm a screaming supplier over a late delivery, watched her rearrange the schedule so a single mother on staff could make her son's school recital, watched her settle disputes between waiters twice her age without raising her voice once. The employees who used to whisper about her, the clumsy one, the fat one, the one who's always about to get fired, started asking her opinion instead, started trusting her. She earned it. She hadn't expected to, and in quieter moments, she started noticing things about Adrian too, small, inconvenient things that didn't fit the reputation stitched to his name. She caught him one evening in the back hallway, speaking low with Marco, one of the line cooks, a man with 3 kids and a wife recovering from surgery. She only caught the tail end of it. Adrian sliding an envelope into Marco's hand, waving off his stammered thanks, telling him gruffly to put it toward the hospital and not toward Pride. He noticed Lucy watching, and his expression shuttered instantly, like a door closing. "Don't," he said flatly. "Mention it to no one." "Why?" she asked, ashamed of being decent. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite a smile. "Decent men don't survive long in my world, Lucy. Best, nobody confuses me for one." She didn't have an answer for that. She thought about it long after he'd gone. By the second week, her wariness hadn't disappeared, but it had softened into something more complicated. A cautious, reluctant curiosity about the man beneath the tailored suits and the terrifying reputation. Then she found the key again. It had been sitting in her desk drawer since the morning she'd taken it from the old manager's closet. And curiosity finally won out over caution. Late one night, after the last table had cleared and the kitchen had gone quiet, Lucy took a flashlight and went looking for whatever door it belonged to. She found it behind the dry storage room. A narrow, unmarked door she'd walked past 100 times without a second glance, half hidden behind stacked crates of olive oil. The old iron key slid into the lock like it had been waiting for her. It turned with a heavy, grinding click. Beyond it, stone steps descended into darkness, air rushing up cool and stale, thick with the smell of old dust and older secrets. Lucy hesitated only a moment before her flashlight beam swept the darkness below, and she stepped down. The tunnel opened into a series of rooms carved from brick and stone, clearly decades old. Storage crates lined one wall. A second room held filing cabinets, their drawers stiff with age, papers yellowed and brittle inside. Old photographs, sepia-toned, curling at the edges, showed families huddled together, frightened faces, children clutching suitcases. In another corner, wrapped in oilcloth and half forgotten, sat a stack of old weapons, rusted but unmistakable. Lucy's flashlight trembled slightly as she crouched to examine one of the photographs. A young man stood in it, dark-eyed, unmistakably familiar, despite the decades separating him from the man Lucy now worked for. "You shouldn't be down here." Lucy spun, heart slamming to find Adrian standing at the base of the stairs, his face unreadable in the dim light. She hadn't heard him come down. "I found the key," she said, refusing to apologize. "What is this place?" For a long moment, she thought he'd refuse to answer. Then something in him seemed to give way. "My father built this," he said quietly, stepping further into the room. During the old wars, when families like these, he gestured to the photographs, had nowhere else to run. This tunnel moved them, hid them, kept them alive when men far worse than me were hunting them through these streets. Lucy looked at the photograph again, at the frightened, hopeful faces. "You didn't buy this restaurant to expand your empire," she said slowly, understanding dawning. "You bought it to protect this." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Someone's been asking questions about this place, about what my father hid here. I intend to make sure they never find it." Before Lucy could ask who, a floorboard creaked overhead, faint but unmistakable. Adrian's entire posture shifted, sharpened, the warmth of a moment ago vanishing into something colder and more alert. "Stay here," he said, already moving toward the stairs. Outside, across the rain-slicked street, a dark sedan idled in the shadow between street lamps. A man in the back seat lowered a camera, having just captured a dozen photographs of Gina's Ristorante, the entrance, the alley door, the delivery access around back. Victor Romano leaned forward from the front passenger seat, watching the restaurant's windows with quiet, patient interest. "He's protecting something in there," Victor murmured almost to himself. "Something worth more than the whole building." He smiled faintly, reaching for his phone. "Let's find out exactly what." Adrian didn't return to the tunnel that night. He checked the street, found nothing but rain and empty parking spaces, and came back down only long enough to walk Lucy out and lock the door behind them both. He said little, but something had shifted between them. A door cracked open that neither seemed willing to close again. Over the following days, Lucy found herself learning things about Adrian Moretti that had nothing to do with tunnels or empires, or the fear that followed him through every room he entered. It started with small things: a photograph in his office, half hidden behind a stack of ledgers, of a woman with dark hair and a fearless, tilted smile. Lucy noticed it on a Tuesday and didn't ask. He noticed her noticing. "My mother," he said, before she could pretend she hadn't seen it. "You don't talk about her." No. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. But 2 nights later, over a shared pot of coffee after the restaurant had emptied, he offered it to her anyway, unprompted, like a man setting down something heavy he'd carried too long alone. "She died when I was 12, he said. "Cancer, fast." His voice stayed level, but something behind his eyes went distant. "My father built empires out of fear because he thought it would protect us. After she died, I learned the same lesson. Fear keeps people obedient. Obedient people don't leave you." "That sounds lonely," Lucy said quietly. "It's efficient." But he didn't quite meet her eyes when he said it. She thought of the photograph again, the woman's fearless smile, and something clicked into place she hadn't expected. "I remind you of her," she said slowly. "That night. With the coffee. That's why you smiled." Adrian's jaw tightened, the closest thing to being caught off guard she'd seen from him. "She was the only person who ever spoke to men like my father without flinching," he said finally. I hadn't seen that look in a very long time. Then a maid pointed her finger at me and told me to fire her. Lucy didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And for once the silence between them didn't feel like distance. It felt like something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to name. Victor Romano, meanwhile, had grown careless in exactly the way dangerous men often did when they believed themselves unwatched. Lucy caught the tail end of a phone call on Thursday evening, ducking past the loading dock to check a delivery. Victor's voice, low and clipped, drifted from behind a stack of crates. Tunnels confirmed. Records, weapons, documentation going back 30 years. If it gets out, it takes down half the families in this city, ours included. A pause. I'll get you access. Just be patient. Lucy froze, her blood running cold. By the time she rounded the crates, Victor had already pocketed the phone, his expression smoothing into practiced calm. Everything all right, Lucy? He asked, too pleasant. Fine, she managed, and walked away faster than she meant to. She told Adrian that same night, breathless, certain he'd move immediately. Instead, he frowned, weighing her words with visible reluctance. Victor's been with my family 15 years, he said. He was at my father's funeral. He's more loyal to this organization than anyone I know. I know what I heard. You heard a phone call, out of context, from a man who runs security for half my operations. Of course he discusses the tunnel. Adrian's voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. Leave it, Lucy. She left his office that night, angrier than she'd been in weeks. Not at him, exactly, but at the quiet, sinking feeling that she was right and utterly unable to prove it. If Adrian wouldn't listen, she'd have to watch Victor herself. She started paying closer attention. Small things. Who Victor spoke to, how often he lingered near the basement door, the calls he took outside instead of in. She said nothing more to Adrian. She didn't trust herself not to be dismissed again. The investigating cost her sleep she didn't have to spare. Between double shifts, watching Victor and managing a restaurant now operating at triple its old capacity, exhaustion finally caught up with her on a rain-heavy Saturday night. Adrian found her an hour after close, slumped over the office desk, invoices scattered beneath her folded arms, breathing slow and even in the particular stillness of someone who hadn't meant to fall asleep at all. He stood in the doorway a long moment, something unreadable moving across his face. He didn't wake her. Instead, he crossed the room quietly, shrugged off his suit jacket, and draped it gently over her shoulders. Careful, deliberate, the kind of gesture that belonged to an entirely different man than the one whose name emptied restaurants. He watched her sleep for a moment longer than he probably meant to, then dimmed the lamp and left the door slightly ajar behind him. Lucy never woke, but she'd remember the warmth of that jacket long after morning came. Downstairs, long after the restaurant had gone dark and silent, Victor Romano moved through the empty kitchen with practiced, unhurried steps. He reached the storage room, glanced once toward the stairs to be sure he was alone, and produced a small brass key of his own, copied weeks ago from an unattended ring, waiting patiently for exactly this moment. The tunnel door unlocked with a soft, final click. Victor pulled out his phone, typed a single line, and hit send. Access secured. Come tonight. Behind him, the darkness of the tunnel yawned open, undisturbed and unguarded, for the first time in 30 years, wide open to the enemy waiting just outside. Adrian just quietly covered Lucy with his jacket while she slept. And somewhere below them, betrayal was already unlocking the door. Nobody saw this coming, not even Lucy. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to realize way too late that the danger was already inside? Comment below and let me know. I read every single one. Chapter 5 is where everything explodes. Literally, you do not want to miss what happens next. The attack came at the worst possible hour. Saturday dinner service, the restaurant full to capacity, candlelight flickering over white tablecloths and the low hum of contented conversation. Lucy was crossing the floor with a tray of desserts when the front windows exploded inward. Glass sprayed across the dining room in a glittering wave. Screams erupted instantly. Men in dark clothing poured through the shattered frames and the front doors simultaneously, weapons already raised. Moving with the brutal efficiency of people who'd planned this for weeks, the lights died a heartbeat later. Someone had cut the power at the box outside, plunging the restaurant into chaos lit only by scattered candles and the strobing flash of gunfire aimed at the ceiling to force compliance. "Everyone down," a voice roared. "Nobody move." Lucy's tray hit the floor. Every instinct told her to freeze, to duck behind the nearest table, to become as small and invisible as she'd spent years being. Instead, something colder and clearer took over. The same thing that had made her point a finger at Adrian Moretti 3 weeks ago. She moved. This way. Kitchen, now, she hissed to the nearest table. A young couple frozen mid-scream, shoving them toward the service hallway. She grabbed a sobbing child from beneath an overturned table, hoisted the girl onto her hip, and kept moving, gathering frightened customers like a current pulling them toward safety. She herded a dozen people down the back stairwell toward the storage level, shoved the fire door shut behind them, and threw the emergency bolt with hands that had somehow stopped shaking. "Stay down, stay quiet," she told them, voice steady even as her heart slammed against her ribs. "Nobody comes up until I say so." Then she went back up. The dining room had become a war zone. Gunmen swept between overturned tables, herding remaining customers toward the center of the room. Lucy ducked low behind the service counter, grabbed the industrial coffee urn still scalding from the dinner rush, and hurled its contents across the nearest attacker's face. He screamed, staggering back, and Lucy was already moving, snatching a heavy serving tray off the rack and swinging it two-handed into the ribs of a second gunman as he turned toward the sound. She wasn't a fighter. She'd never held a weapon in her life, but she'd carried trays of food up and down these floors for years, and she used every ounce of that strength now, throwing plates, hurling silverware, upending an entire cart of hot entrees into the path of a third man closing in on a terrified elderly couple. Near the kitchen, she yanked the fire suppression lever without hesitation. A deafening alarm shrieked through the building as chemical mist and water sprayed from the ceiling, blinding attackers and creating just enough chaos for another cluster of customers to scramble toward the stairwell she'd secured. That was when Adrian arrived. He came through the back entrance with 4 of his men, weapons already drawn, expression carved from stone. The moment he saw the wreckage, the shattered windows, the smoke, Lucy's silhouette moving through chemical fog with a serving tray in one hand, something in his face went dangerously calm. "Clear the room," he snapped to his men. "Nobody touches her." The shootout that followed tore the restaurant apart. Gunfire echoed off brick and glass, bullets shredding through tablecloths and overturned chairs. Adrian moved through it like he'd been born for exactly this, cold and precise, cutting down 2 attackers before they registered his presence. Lucy stayed low, dragging a wounded waiter toward the stairwell despite the chaos exploding around her, ignoring the way bullets chewed through the wall inches above her head. "Lucy, get down!" Adrian's voice cut through the noise, raw with something that wasn't just command. She didn't get down. She reached a trapped busboy pinned beneath an overturned table and hauled him free, shoving him towards safety even as glass rained down around them both. Within minutes, though it felt like hours, the last attacker fell, and an unnatural quiet settled over the wrecked dining room, broken only by the hiss of the fire suppression system and scattered, racket breathing. Adrian lowered his weapon slowly, scanning the destruction, shattered windows, overturned tables, smoke curling toward the ceiling. His men fanned out to secure the perimeter. "Victor," he said suddenly, turning in a slow circle. "Where's Victor?" Nobody answered. One of his men shook his head. Another checked the front entrance, the alley, the street outside. Victor Romano was nowhere. Adrian's expression hardened into something Lucy had never seen from him. Not rage, exactly, but the terrible, focused stillness of a man, recalculating everything he thought he knew. He should have been at the door the second the shooting started. Adrian said quietly, almost to himself. He wasn't. Lucy's stomach dropped as pieces clicked together. The phone call she'd overheard, the dismissal she'd received, Victor's careful, deliberate absence at exactly the moment it mattered most. "The tunnel," she breathed. Adrian's eyes snapped to hers. They moved together without another word, sprinting past the wreckage of the dining room toward the storage closet, toward the narrow door that should have been locked, that Lucy herself had locked only hours ago. It stood open. The old iron key dangled uselessly from the latch. Adrian took the stairs 2 at a time, Lucy close behind despite every instinct screaming at her to stay back. The tunnel below flickered with unfamiliar light, a lantern or a flashlight propped against the stone wall. And there, in the center of the old storage room, surrounded by decades of hidden history, stood Victor Romano. His weapon was raised, leveled directly at Adrian's chest. his expression void of the loyalty he'd worn like a mask for 15 years. Victor, Adrian started, disbelief cracking through his composure for the first time Lucy had ever witnessed. Don't, Victor said quietly, finger steady on the trigger. Not another step. Either of you. Lucy froze at the top of the stairs, heart hammering, staring down at the man she'd tried to warn everyone about, and the gun now aimed squarely at the only person who'd ever made her feel like she mattered. 15 years. Adrian said quietly, not moving, his eyes locked on the gun aimed at his chest. 15 years, Victor. Victor's hand didn't waver. 15 years of watching your father build an empire on fear, and then watching you inherit it like it was owed to you. His voice carried none of the warmth Lucy remembered from him, only a cold, patient bitterness that had clearly been years in the making. The Romano Syndicate offered me something your family never did, a future that didn't depend on staying loyal to a name, so you sold us out. Adrian's voice stayed level, but Lucy could see the fury banked just beneath it. The tunnel, the attack tonight, all of it, Victor confirmed. The evidence down here could bury half the families in this city, including yours. I was going to make sure it burned before anyone found it. And you... His aim shifted fractionally. You were never supposed to walk down these stairs again. He fired. The shot caught Adrian's shoulder, spinning him hard into the stone wall. He crumpled, blood already spreading dark across his shirt, a sharp cry tearing out of him before he could stop it. Adrian! Lucy's scream tore out of her before she'd even decided to move. Stay back! Victor's weapon swung toward her instantly, and for one terrible second Lucy stared straight down the barrel, every instinct in her body screaming to run. She didn't run. She'd spent her whole life being the person who froze, who apologized, who made herself small so other people's anger had less to land on. She was done being that person. Her eyes caught the old lantern Victor had set against the wall, and beside it, one of the antique weapons still wrapped in decades-old oilcloth, forgotten in the corner where it had rested for 30 years. You're pathetic, you know that, she said, taking a step forward instead of back, drawing his aim fully onto herself and away from Adrian slumped against the wall. 15 years of loyalty, and you sell it out because somebody offered you a better deal. That's not betrayal, Victor. That's just weak. Shut up. You planned to kill a man who trusted you like family. She pressed, another step closer, adrenaline burning through the fear. What does that make you? Not powerful, just a coward with a gun. Victor's face twisted with fury, exactly as she'd hoped, his attention narrowing entirely onto her, instead of the wounded man bleeding out 10 feet away. In the half-second, his eyes flared with rage. Lucy grabbed the lantern and hurled it directly at his head. It struck his temple hard enough to stagger him. His shot went wide, the bullet cracking into stone above her head, and Lucy didn't hesitate. She lunged forward and slammed both hands into his gun arm, knocking the weapon clattering across the floor into the darkness. Victor recovered fast, backhanding her hard enough to send her sprawling. But by then, Adrian had forced himself upright despite the wound, tackling Victor from the side with what strength he had left. They crashed into the old filing cabinets, papers and photographs scattering across the stone floor. 30 years of hidden history raining down around the two men grappling over it. The struggle ended fast and brutal. Adrian, wounded but furious, drove Victor back against the wall hard enough to crack stone. His forearm braced against the other man's throat. Why? Adrian demanded, voice raw. After everything, why? Victor's laugh came out wet and broken. Because loyalty never paid my debts. He rasped. Blood. Lucy realized with a lurch that he'd taken a wound of his own in the scuffle, a shard of glass or stone driven deep during the fall, soaked dark through his shirt. The Romanos promised me out, a life where I wasn't just your father's shadow. His strength gave out. Adrian eased him down against the wall, some old instinct of loyalty even now refusing to simply let him fall. The evidence, Victor whispered, eyes already glassy. It survives. That's the only thing I couldn't do. Couldn't destroy what he built. His gaze found Lucy, weak and searching. She stopped me. He didn't speak again. By the time police sirens finally wailed distantly above street level, Victor Romano was gone, and the tunnel, 30 years of hidden history, evidence and truth, remained exactly where Adrian's father had left it. Adrian sat slumped against the cold stone wall as Lucy pressed a torn strip of tablecloth hard against his shoulder, her hand steady despite everything. He watched her work in silence, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You could have run," he said finally, voice hoarse. "When he pointed that gun at you, you had every reason to run." "I know. Why didn't you?" Lucy tied off the makeshift bandage, meeting his eyes for the first time since the shot. "Because I've already lost people I loved," she said quietly. "I wasn't about to stand there and let someone else lose you too." Something in Adrian's face cracked open completely. Every wall he'd spent a lifetime building crumbling in the space of one sentence. He'd expected loyalty, obligation, even fear. He hadn't expected someone to simply refuse to let him die because losing him would cost her something. Nobody had ever chosen him like that. Not once. Not in his entire life. He reached up, and for a moment his fingers brushed hers where she still held the bandage in place. Not desperate, not urgent, just quiet. Searching contact. "Will you stay?" he asked softly. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. She didn't answer. 6 weeks later, Gina's Ristorante reopened its doors to a line that stretched down the block. The windows had been replaced with something sturdier, though the warm gold light still spilled out onto the avenue exactly as it always had. New tablecloths, freshly painted walls. The scorch marks and bullet holes were gone, but Lucy noticed Adrian had insisted on keeping the original bar, the original chandelier, the bones of the place intact, even as everything around them changed. The community had rallied harder than anyone expected. Regulars who'd fled during the siege came back within days, bringing friends, posting about the restaurant that had survived a war and come back beautiful. Lucy suspected some of that goodwill traced back to the newspapers, the ones now running headlines about a sprawling corruption case built on documents recovered from a decades-old tunnel beneath a small Italian restaurant. 3 syndicates dismantled, 24 indictments. A wave of arrests that had nothing to do with parking tickets and everything to do with 30 years of buried evidence finally seeing daylight. Adrian's name appeared in those articles too, though never quite the way it used to. Local businessman cooperates with investigators. Property developer announces Community Revitalization Fund. He was rebuilding something larger than a restaurant, piece by piece, turning the machinery of fear his father had built into something that no longer required anyone to be afraid. Lucy ran the floor now with an ease that still surprised her some mornings when she caught her reflection in the polished window glass. The same employees who'd once rolled their eyes when she dropped a tray now came to her with scheduling conflicts, with customer complaints, with problems they trusted her to solve. Nobody called her clumsy anymore. Nobody looked through her like glass. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, the door chimed, and Lucy looked up to see her father standing in the entrance, leaning only lightly on his cane, color back in his face for the first time in years. "Dad!" She crossed the room fast, careful not to knock him off balance as she pulled him into a hug. "You didn't tell me it looked like this," he said, gazing around at the golden light, the packed tables, the framed photograph near the bar of the restaurant's long history. "Lucia, look at you, she countered, blinking back sudden tears. "Walking in here on your own. No medications finally working." He squeezed her hand. "And my daughter runs the finest restaurant in the city, apparently. Had to see it for myself." She sat him at the best table by the window, brought him coffee. Carefully, this time no accidents, and watched him take in the space with quiet wonder. The restaurant that had once been the site of her worst night, now the backdrop of one of her best. Later that evening, after the dinner rush had softened into low conversation and clinking glasses, Adrian found her near the bar, exactly where the coffee had spilled all those weeks ago. "Your father looks well," he said. "He does." She smiled, still a little disbelieving of it herself. "Thank you for the specialist you recommended. I know that wasn't," she paused, "an accident." "No accident." He studied her for a moment, something unreadable behind his eyes. "I've been meaning to tell you something." "That sounds ominous." "The night you said fire me then." His voice softened, quieter than she'd ever heard it. "You saved me." Lucy laughed, startled. "I nearly got myself shot." "That's not exactly saving anyone." "No," Adrian said, shaking his head slowly. "You reminded me that respect can't be bought with fear. Every person in that restaurant flinched when I walked in. Every person except you. I spent my whole life believing fear was the only currency that mattered. You prove me wrong with 4 words and a pointed finger. Lucy felt her throat tighten. I was just tired, Adrian. I wasn't trying to teach you anything. I know. The corner of his mouth lifted, something warm breaking through the composed stillness he usually wore like armor. That's exactly why it worked. He reached into his jacket and produced a folder, sliding it across the bar toward her. What's this? A partnership agreement. Not employment. Not a favor. He held her gaze steadily. Equal ownership of Gina's, and a seat on the board of the development fund. I'm rebuilding everything my family spent decades tearing down, Lucy, and I don't want to do it without you standing beside me. Not behind me, beside me. Lucy stared at Thulda, then at him, throat too tight to speak for a long moment. You're serious? Completely. She thought of the woman who'd walked into this restaurant 6 weeks ago expecting to be fired, expecting to be forgotten, expecting nothing but another exhausting shift in a life that never seemed to let up. That woman felt impossibly far away now. Okay, she said softly, then again steadier. Okay, yes. Adrian's smile, rare, real, entirely unguarded, was answer enough. Later, when the last customers had gone and the restaurant had settled into the particular quiet of closing time, Lucy stood alone for a moment near the spot where it had all begun. The exact tile where coffee had spilled that stormy night. The exact place where she'd pointed a trembling finger at the most feared man in the city and said the 4 words that changed everything. She thought about the woman she used to be. Invisible, exhausted, overlooked by everyone who walked through that door. She thought about how close she'd come to simply accepting that life, the way she'd been taught to accept things. Sometimes the bravest words aren't spoken by the strongest person in the room. Sometimes they come from the exhausted woman everyone underestimated, who simply looked the city's most feared mafia boss in the eyes and said, "Fire me then." From an exhausted maid nobody respected, to an equal partner who changed a man's entire life. Lucy's story is proof that one moment of courage can rewrite everything. What's one bold decision you made that ended up changing your life completely? I read every comment, so tell me your story below. If this series moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their breaking point could be their turning point too. Thank you for reading till the end.